back to Vinyl Friday, where I go through my records and talk about why I love them. Before we jump into the episode, I just want to say I'm very excited because I'm currently sitting at 9,990 subscribers, which for those of you who can count means that I'm frightfully close to 10,000 subscribers. So I'm having a little celebration here for myself, and I invite you to join me because today we're talking about a classic album, one that won the poll that I had earlier in the month. So I want to try a new thing this year. It's 2025, it's January, we can try new things. Where at the beginning of the month, I put up a poll for a classic album to be covered later in the month. And you can all go to the community tab and vote on which of the 4 albums you would like me to cover later in the month. So that's the shtick, that's the format. And the way that I arrive at this classic album status is it needs to be an album that has a place on either a Rolling Stones 500 Greatest Albums of All Time, or in a book that I have called 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. The album we're listening to today is on both of those lists and a handful of other similar greatest albums, blah, blah, blah lists. So we have it on good faith that this is a classic album. It did peak at number 44 in the Billboard chart when it was released, but we're gonna disregard that because history has been kind to this album. We're going to be listening today to Buffalo Springfield Again by Buffalo Springfield. It sounds like this.
For the thought that I caught at my head is the event of the sea.
Just making change, plastic chairs.
Expecting to fly. She knows all I cry. Hung upside down. And I'm hung up. It's alright, the open fire. So held up, broken arrow.
So what we're going to do with this album today is we're going to look at the hot mess express that it was to make. And then we're going to break down one of my favorite songs. Before we do that, though, I would like to open by saying that there is this odd aura of kismet around Los Angeles in the mid to late 1960s, particularly as it pertained to David Crosby, Stephen Stills, Graham Nash, and Neil Young. And in many ways, I view Buffalo Springfield as the prequel to everything that those men would produce and blossom into in the late 60s and early 70s. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I'm just going to establish that. That's our establishing shot. There it is. Now we're going to go back into the past. We're going back in time. It's now 1965. A young Stephen Stills is on tour with his group, the A-Go-Go Singers, in Toronto. He goes to a gig and he happens upon another young man, one Neil Young.
And he was doing exactly what I wanted to do, which was to play folk songs on electric guitar. We hung out together for a week. We talked and dreamt and fantasized about what we wanted to do, and we were inseparable.
But their orbits don't overlap. They just kiss at this point. Stephen Stills goes to Los Angeles to audition for the Monkees.
Hey, we're the Monkees, and people say we monkey around.
He is unsuccessful, but he's told that there is work for him in the industry if he were to form a band himself. So he selects Richie Furay, who is one of his Go-Go compatriots. They set about to build a band. At around the same time, Neil Young, who is still in Canada, is listening to the radio, and he hears California Dreamin' by the Mamas and the Papas.
California, California dreaming.
He says to his bassist, Bruce, he says, "We're going to California." I'd like to interrupt the narrative for a minute here to say that several years later, Mama Cass of the Mamas and the Papas was, arguably, the one to bring together David Crosby, Stephen Stills, and Graham Nash to sing, but we're getting ahead of ourselves again. I'd just like to drop a pin in that, okay? Don't forget. It's important to my future thesis. Neil has heard tell that Stephen Stills is also in Los Angeles, so he and Bruce Palmer, the bassist, drive around Los Angeles in Neil's hearse for a few days. Now, if it were me, I don't think that's the best way to find someone who you vaguely are aware lives in the same city. But, you know, he was driving around, giving it a good go, checking out the bars and the folk clubs, but to no avail. And eventually he's like, you know what, Bruce, this isn't working out. Let's go to San Francisco. And they hop in their car, they head north, and they get stuck in a traffic jam on Sunset Boulevard. Meanwhile, in the opposite direction, Stephen Stills and Richie Furay are in the same traffic jam but heading south. And they had sort of vaguely been looking for Neil Young themselves because they were trying to form a band and they didn't have enough players. And the two cars met in traffic. Stephen Stills and Richie Furay looked over at the hearse and they were like, wait, isn't that Neil Young's car? They were able to all pull over and extricate themselves from the traffic jam. And they were like, yes, let's form a band. That's a great idea. And thus, Buffalo Springfield was born. The name comes from a steamroller that was parked outside someone's house, a Buffalo Springfield. Editor Nancy will show you a photo of this beautiful machine now. So you see what I mean? There are these lovely little magical moments, these pretty little coincidences in the genetics of the Crosby, Stills, Nash Young family. They put out a debut album, and it's okay, it's pretty good, but it receives a sort of lukewarm critical response until Stephen Stills writes this song about a riot that he saw happening on Sunset Boulevard.
Anyone under the age of 18 years old remaining in the area will be arrested.
He calls it For What It's Worth.
Stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Actually, he doesn't call it For What It's Worth. Pause. He didn't like this song, but he took it to the record executives and he's like, I'll play the song for what it's worth. Later on, they're recording the song and he's like, I guess I should name this thing. And his bandmates are like, what do you mean? You did name this thing. And Steve goes, no, I haven't. What are you talking about? And his bandmates say, when you first played this, you said, I'm going to play the song for what it's worth. And so it was named. It was a big hit. So they pulled the album off the shelves and they re-released it, swapping the big single track for one of the other lesser album tracks. And that was a big hit. So now they're doing quite well for themselves. The time comes for them to make a follow-up album because they have a 4-album deal. They have obligations. And that album, this album, is a joy to listen to, but it was a dysfunctional dumpster fire to record. First off, their bassist, Bruce Palmer, is busted for drugs and deported. Then there's this other problem. This band has 3 songwriters with 3 disproportionately large egos, and there are only a limited number of songs that you can pack onto this piece of plastic, right? So they're vying for the greatest real estate on the record. Stephen Stills has had a big hit, so he feels like he deserves more space on the record. The others understandably beg to differ. So, in particular, Neil Young and Stephen Stills are butting heads. They're constantly getting into arguments. Neil Young has started working with producer Jack Nitzsche. Nitzsche. It's a surname. It has a lot of consonants in it. Jack Nitzsche. If I've got it wrong, please correct me. I don't even need to ask. You will definitely correct me. Producer Jack, we're gonna call him. Producer Jack decides he's working with Neil Young. He's not going to be producing everyone else's songs, which is frustrating for the rest of the band. If I were in the band, I would have been frustrated by that. On top of this, Neil Young keeps quitting the band, and then coming back, and then quitting the band. He's not wanting to play lead guitar on Stephen Stills' songs, which wouldn't be a problem except for the fact that he is the band's lead guitarist. He gets notions of becoming a solo artist and starts literally hiding from his bandmates, and Stephen Stills steals his guitar one day. It's at this point in my research that I had to look up how old these men were. And I can report that Neil Young was 21 years old at the time of recording, and Stephen Stills was 22. But both of them were behaving like toddlers. Meanwhile, Bruce Palmer, who was still in Canada, cut his hair and snuck back over the border to rejoin the band, at which point he resumed the recording of the album, or what was left of it anyway. So because of the different producers on the album, the different musicians on the album, and the fact that the 3 songwriters were each treating his portion of the album as like a third of a solo album as opposed to a joint effort, what we end up with on this album is a completely incohesive collection of fantastic songs. The songs on this album are ambitious and impressive. Neil is composing these sprawling orchestral suites with the help of producer Jack, who had ties with Phil Spector and the Wrecking Crew. So he's bringing in Wrecking Crew musicians, and they're doing these lush and beautifully orchestrated suites of music. It's almost like chamber pop. No. Hell, I'm gonna throw all caution to the winds. It is chamber pop. Fight me. He's also playing with concepts on this album. For instance, he opens the song Broken Arrow with the beginning of Mr. Soul. And they've overlaid that with audio from an early Beatles concert. It sounds like this. Oh, and also, will it Beatles? Of course it will. I mean, screaming isn't my favorite way to open a song, but it's a concept, and I find that pretty interesting, so I do respect that. That song is a fantastic example of what I'm trying to describe because it changes feels and time signatures throughout the song. Stephen Stills is also experiencing with unusual song structures. For instance, his song Bluebird starts as one thing, and the ending is a totally different version of the same song. It's like a banjo-centric country folk interpretation.
Listen to my bluebird laugh. She misses her own.
And speaking of country, Richie Furay is leaning heavily into the country. Everything, maybe not everything that he's bringing, but a lot of the tracks that he's bringing have like slide guitar and other things that country songs have.
Wonder why.
But no, they're very acoustic, very rustic, and they sit firmly within the field of country music. And on every song that they have the drummer Dewey Martin singing on, he's doing his best Otis Redding impression. So it really is a patchwork of an album. Nothing matches anything else. The sequencing is really weird, but I mean, how can you do good sequencing if none of the songs fit with each other? If you can get past that though, the album's wonderful. While their debut album was much poppier, more cheerful, and very much a band album,
You know you can't run away and hide.
this one has a much darker undercurrent. It's got heavier guitars. It's got heavier lyrical themes.
Look at the sad goodbyes. Every day's a killing time.
Even the happier songs like Richie Furay's Child's Claim to Fame, it's really just taking potshots at Neil Young. To be fair, I think Neil Young probably deserved it at least a little bit. Apparently he would get really upset if producer Jack wasn't immediately available for him, and he would say things like, "I'm not just anyone, I'm Neil Young!" Which is bold for a 21-year-old. It's an album on which Stephen Stills and Neil Young are finding their creative voices. I'm sure Richie is as well, but he's not really central to the story, so we're gonna leave him here. There are certain songs on the album that foreshadow the creative direction that the other two are going to take. For instance, if you listen to Expecting to Fly, which is a Neil Young song, it has echoes of Harvest. Which I suppose makes sense because he did continue to work with producer Jack, who did quite a lot of the orchestral work on Harvest. Or the song Every Days,
Look at the sad goodbyes. Every day's a killing time.
which is one of Stephen Stills' sounds like it would really nicely fit on Deja Vu.
And he worked like the devil to be more.
Anyway, neither of those is the song that I've chosen to talk about today. The song that I would like to discuss in today's episode, my favorite song on the album, is a track called Rock and Roll Woman, and it is one of Stephen Stills'. It sounds like this. God, I love this song. This is such a good song, and here is why. It is a song that is built around the push and pull of tension and release, and it's all in that riff right there. From the top of the song, they introduce this riff and they're like, this is what this song is about. I hope you like it. And how it works is that there is a pattern that is played over a single note, and that same pattern is then repeated, but over a different note. And we'll get the piano correspondent to demonstrate this for us, because this is not helping anyone. Piano correspondent! Hello everyone, piano correspondent here, looking forward to telling you about this amazing song. So here's what the anchor was very ineloquently trying to describe just before. This is the riff, and it is first played over an F. Immediately after, it's played over a D. When it's played over the F, it creates one sort of family of notes. Like this. Please don't tell my childhood piano teacher that I'm playing the piano like this. And when it's played over the D, it's that same constellation of notes, but it's a different family now because it's played over this. What makes it sound so dark and mysterious over the F? The notes form major seventh chords. By that I mean 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This note. It's sleek, it's mysterious. When you're playing that same riff over the D, that fancy, sophisticated major seventh becomes more of a pop seventh, which is a lot more playful. By that I mean if it were major seventh, it would sound like this. See, much too serious. No, it sounds like this. So it's this constant back and forth between these very serious, mysterious chords and these much more playful ones. That interplay makes this a fantastic song. On top of that, you throw in some discordance. When the top harmony comes in the final verses of the song, the backing vocals are singing this. And over the first bass note, the F, that produces some really ugly discordant chords like this. Yuck. But it sounds pretty good over the D. So there you have it. Tension, discord, release, harmony, darkness, light, seriousness, play, frivolity. We find pleasure in music at the points of difference, and this song is built entirely around this back and forth, around that point of difference. I hope that makes sense. It's dark, it's mysterious. The second chord, by contrast, sort of sly and mischievous. Now, given that this is a song about Grace Slick, she is the rock and roll woman in question, I actually really like this musical characterization because that's sort of how I feel about Grace Slick. She is dark and mysterious, but also sly and mischievous. Certainly in her vocal performance. I don't know her personally, so she may be a perfectly docile person in real life, but based on how Stephen Stills is describing her, I would not expect that to be the case. If you've met Grace Slick, sound off in the comments. Another thing that makes this a great song is the instrumentation. The bass, Bruce Palmer is playing on this one. He's not playing on every song on the album for reasons discussed earlier. Drugs. But he is playing on this one. I've seen Bruce Palmer compared to James Jamerson, who is, of course, the legendary Motown bassist. I talk about him in more detail in my episode on Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, so you can check that out here if you would like. I can see the points of similarity, right? Because Bruce Palmer is nowhere near as in the pocket as James Jamerson, but he does take himself on little walks throughout the song. It's kind of wild, and it really adds to the overall wildness of the song. Like, have a listen to what he's doing in the last verse. Bass correspondent, you're up.
She's a friend of mine, and with sorrow, I see her face is lined. She's no longer blind. She's just hard to find.
There we go. That was it. Then we've got our vocals. The razor edge of Stephen Stills' vocal is on full brilliant display in this song. There's this, like, yearning groaning that he does, and it's especially on the long notes, and especially when the melody bends. I'll show you what I mean.
She's a joy to know.
Isn't that good? That's some good singing, man. There's nothing in the song that is explicitly sexual, the lyrics, etc. But there is something I find kind of primal in Stephen Still's delivery of the vocal. It does a good job. There are also some great backing vocals at the bridge of this song. They begin in tandem with the lead vocal, and then they split apart, and the lead vocal goes up, and the backing vocals come down, and we've got this call and response and contrary motion, and that sounds like this.
She will follow me.
Isn't that great? Do you know, do you know? It's really the only instance of call and response on this song, so far as I can... Yes, it sounds great. So they start together, they split apart, and then right at the end of this bridge section, they reunite and open wide here. Just so much lovely masculine falsetto. Sounds great. Sounds really good. That's what we're here to say, right? This music is good. And this is arguably the climax of the song, right? Because just as all of the vocals reach this peak, out from underneath them unfurl this shrieking guitar and this wailing organ solo. So much vibrato, so much distortion, brings the song to this raucous close, and it sounds like it's gonna have this big finish. But that's an effective way to close a song. I love that because it completely defies your expectation. Immediate and stark contrast from the rest of the energy of the entire song. The song has this mad frenetic energy throughout. It's electric, partly because Bruce Palmer's on another planet. That's the only moment of the song, except for the introduction, where everything is in a hush. And the best part about that is that tremolo guitar is there throughout, but it's overshadowed by everything else until this point. I love that that's how they chose to end the song. It's good production work. But probably not by producer Jack, because this is a Stephen Stills song. Production Steve Stills and Neil Young. Well, good on them for working together. They weren't very good at that, historically. So why was this the song of choice for today's episode? Simply, I've chosen this song because it feels like a prophecy. I don't know if you remember, but what's probably about 10 minutes ago, I mentioned that Neil Young was constantly quitting the band in 1967, on again, off again. And one of those times was right before they were due to play the Monterey Pop Festival. So Stephen Stills asked his new friend David Crosby to stand in, and they played this song together because they had been jamming, and this is kind of what came out of it. In fact, in the credits, we've got inspiration David Crosby. And of course, they wrote that in the liner notes, not knowing that Stephen Stills' relationship with David Crosby was going to determine their fates, their mutual fates, their individual fates. Everything they did from that point forward, in terms of their career, was tied up in some way or another, almost to the end of David Crosby's life. And in fact, there have been some rumors that he's actually on the recording. I think that these rumors are true because David Crosby has a very trademark high, clear voice. The song opens with two voices singing in unison, and then the second time they split apart into a two-part harmony, and I suspect that David Crosby is the upper harmony. I'll show you. I've spent a lot of hours of my life listening to David Crosby, Stephen Stills, and Graham Nash sing together in different permutations, and to me, that sounds like David Crosby. Obviously, I'm a huge Crosby, Stills, and Nash fan, and I think what I love so much about Rock and Roll Woman is that it sounds like a rough draft of what they'll become. Now, I'm going to go off on a tangent for a minute, but I promise it will link up to everything that we've been discussing so far. I went to a wedding about a week ago, and the couple who are getting married, I think, are sort of the epicenter of my community of musical friends. And so instead of hiring a band for the reception, they asked all of their musical friends to select 2 or 3 different songs to perform. So it's like an open mic style musical portion of the wedding. Because we all knew each other and had played in bands before, each of us would play on someone else's song, or we had like multiple different informal house bands throughout the night. I was having a blast, and I thought, I guess this is what a healthy musical ecosystem looks like. And maybe this is exactly what was happening in Los Angeles in the mid to late 1960s. So I ask myself now the question, was it providence? Was it destiny? Was it magic? Was it fate? Or was this just the product of a really healthy musical ecosystem? I had a lot of fun looking up information for this episode because everybody is tied to everybody else. For example, Graham Parsons, who would go on to be in the later iterations and spin-offs thereof of the Byrds, was playing the same circuits as Stephen Stills in his earlier days in his career. Stephen Stills was good friends with Peter Tork, who went on to successfully audition for the Monkees. When he was starting out, Steve Stills played for a little bit with Van Dyke Parks. They were buddies with John Sebastian. Stephen Stills tried to join the Lovin' Spoonful. I suppose what I'm getting at here is that Stephen Stills failed a lot before he got to the Buffalo, actually before he got to Crosby, Stills, and Nash. But that, I suppose, is the centerpiece of this episode. He had to try out all of these things. They had to work through this extremely difficult album in order to arrive at their final form as Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. The first Buffalo Springfield gig was attended by Chris Hillman of the Byrds, who got him his second gig. Of course, David Crosby was also in the Byrds.
I remember thinking when we did it, this is a bad idea, because they were awfully goddamn good.
One of his earlier stints in Canada, he ran into Joni Mitchell, who would go on to be a big part of that constellation. Her first album was produced by David Crosby. Stephen Stills played bass on that album. One of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young's biggest hits, Our House, was inspired by her because Graham Nash went on to fall head over heels in love with her and to be deeply emotionally damaged when she dumped him. And of course, there was the whole thing with Mama Cass, arguably, because nobody can get their stories straight around here, introducing Crosby, Stills, and Nash to each other with the notion of them singing together. None of this could have happened if there hadn't been this fantastic musical ecosystem.
I think, people have been trying to figure out why it happened there and how it happened there. You can guess, but I don't know if we'll ever get it nailed.
After this album, Buffalo Springfield well and truly fell apart. They did release a final album, but essentially it's a contractual obligation that was stitched together from demos and outtakes and unfinished songs. They sure as hell didn't make it together. Richie Furay and Jim Messina, who had engineered some of these tracks and even played with the band, went on to form the band Poco. Neil Young became a solo artist, as you might know. And as we've now covered, Stephen Stills went to a party with Graham Nash and David Crosby. They sang the song You Don't Have to Cry together a few times. By the third time, they knew all the lyrics, the harmonies were locked in.
You don't have to cry.
And they all burst out laughing because nothing like this had ever happened to any of them. In David Crosby's words, it was scary. But once we knew what we had, you could not pry us apart with a crowbar. We knew we'd locked onto something special, man. Could hear it plain as day. So on that note, maybe there was some strange magic floating about the hills of late 1960s Los Angeles. Who's to say? And that's it from me. If you enjoyed this episode or you would like to support any of my strange endeavors, I will leave a link in the description to my Buy Me a Coffee page, where you are most welcome to make a donation if you wish. No pressure, friends. I would like to extend my most heartfelt thanks to everybody who has made a donation or signed up as a member. You are officially sponsoring this episode. Thank you so much. And if you're curious about what any of my original music sounds like, I will leave a link in the description to that as well. Otherwise, thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you here next week. Have a great weekend!